All right, welcome to the Sunstone Symposium. My name is Heidi. I will be moderating today. This is session 174, Turning on Your Feminine Sexual Self. And just a little spiel about Sunstone. Tagline, I'm sure you've heard it already, so there's more than one way to Mormon, and creating a space and path for everybody here. Please support Sunstone, visiting sunstone.org. In about 2 weeks, the videos will be edited and polished up, so you'll be able to watch them on the Hoover app until the end of the year. And if you are watching digitally, welcome. And we'll be keeping an eye, hoping that audio is working okay. You may put any questions in the Q&A or the chat. If you are here in person, you can ask questions at the end for the Q&A. And if any questions don't get answered, you can still put it in the Hoover app. And then they'll be able to look at them afterwards. So a little bit about our presentation. This session will explore some of the explicit and implicit systemic messaging around the sexual self that girls receive while growing up in the Mormon faith. We will look at how sexual shame, romantic love ideas, church, and family influence girls' development of sexual selfhood. Finally, we will highlight what social science has to offer about what a healthy feminine sexual self can look like. And then a little bit about our presenters. Jenny Elledge is a licensed marriage and family therapist at Symmetry Solutions. She's pursuing certification as a licensed sex therapist. The couples she treats give her the best insight of how Mormonism impacted her sexual self-development. Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, fun little letters and stuff, received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Brigham Young University and her master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Friends University. She also received her certifications as a sex therapist and sex therapist supervisor from the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, also known as ASECT. Helfer is a speaker, writer, and podcaster with 23 years of clinical experience, primarily working with a Mormon clientele around issues of relational health, faith transitions and journeys, and sexuality. She writes a blog called The Mormon Therapist, and hosts the podcast Mormon Mental Health and Mormon Sex Info. Helfer has authored 2 books, One Family, 2 Views about mixed faith marriage, and Check Your Baggage, about challenging sex-negative messaging. Helfer was recently excommunicated from the Mormon Church for issues surrounding her advocacy for sexual health. And Colette Dalton is a licensed clinical social worker who focuses on issues such as depression, anxiety, grief, faith and life transitions, and trauma. She is a member of the LGBTQ+ Affirmative Psychotherapist Guild of Utah and is LGBTQIA+ affirming. She offers therapy services and coaching consultation to individuals and couples and works for Symmetry Solutions. So we will turn our time over to our lovely presenters.
Hello. I want to make sure everyone can hear. Are we good? You good in the room? Okay, cool. We had to figure out a lot of different things to make this work for 3 presenters at the same time. Welcome, everyone. We want to talk to you about turning on your feminine sexual self. Is this the right place for me? We want to give a couple of caveats as we move forward through this presentation. We'll be using vocabulary throughout, so we want to kind of give some definitions about what we mean. We will be talking about females and women, and what we mean by that are all females, meaning you might have been assigned female at birth, raised as a girl, or you might be a trans woman. And what we mean by Mormon is more than one way to Mormon.
Anytime you talk about sex, the lights may go on and off.
It's a sign. If
We're trying to get you in the mood.
So more than one way to Mormon. If you grew up Mormon, if you're still active, semi-active, not active, removed your record, or anything else.
Or had your records removed, right, Natasha?
Right.
For you.
Right.
This is what we mean. Thanks. Okay. Is this the right place for me? If you were taught that your sexuality was for a man's pleasure, this is the right place. If you are a woman who wondered that you might be gay, you have come to the right place. If you realize that your church and your parents did not give you the sex education that you were hoping for, or maybe belatedly learned, I didn't really get enough about that, you have come to the right place. If you've wondered that you might be asexual, meaning I don't really know why a lot of people are even thinking about sex or why we talk about it a lot, you have come to the right place. Or if you have felt or do feel shame about anything sexual, you have come to the right place. And if you feel like you have not tapped into your sexual potential, you've come to the right place.
So in our work as sex therapists, we've really seen in our practice that when women learn that their sexuality is not their own and only to be shared with another, they tend to have a lot more sexual shame, they tend to engage in duty sex a lot more, and they have less orgasmic experience and potential and less pleasure overall. So we see women in our offices who deal with all these issues for a lot of reasons that we'll get into in this presentation. So in talking about where did we learn about our messages from sex, some of these things may resonate with you. So we may have learned things from the church pulpit, like sex has been ordained as from God as good, but only within a marriage between a man and a woman. Sex for procreation is good after marriage. Eroticism is seen as bad as evil, talking about no masturbation, don't look at pornography. You may have heard these things over the pulpit. And then you may have also heard some not great things in lessons. I don't know how many of you ever heard the chewed gum analogy, or the idea that if you've sinned, you have a nail, you're like a nail in a piece of wood, you're the piece of wood with a nail in it, and even though the nail's removed, it still has this nail hole in it. The idea of the shared desserts, a cupcake that everyone passes around and then no one wants to eat. So maybe not great analogies to be hearing in young women's, right? But please tell me I'm not the only one that heard those.
Raise a hand if you did. Yeah, it's pretty much almost all of us.
Yeah, no wonder some of us might have issues around sex. And then you may have learned from other women and heard things. I know that I've been to many a bridal shower, and you hear whispered remarks, and some things are really positive, that, sex is going to be so great, but you may have heard some not as positive messages about sex is painful. You've just got to grit your teeth and bear it. You'll get through it. It'll keep your husband happy. He's going to probably want sex more, and that's just how it is. If you don't put it out, he's going to get it somewhere else. So getting some really interesting, some potentially positive messages, but I know for me, I got a lot of negative messages as well from those places.
I just remembered a story from my own life where I was brave to ask my cousin about sex, and I said, "Why is this good? Or do you have to enjoy it?" And she's like, "Oh, don't worry, you can just read a book and just lay there." And I was like, "Okay."
Yeah, or the it's fine, you can just stare at the ceiling, just, it'll be quicker if you don't do anything, right? Just kind of lay there, take it, think about doing dishes or whatever, and then it'll be over and it'll be fine. No, thank you.
I just want to point out this quote by Emily Nagoski that you see on the right-hand side. "No girl is born hating her body or feeling ashamed of her sexuality. You had to learn that." When you read that, how does that feel to you? Does that resonate with you? Where do you see that? Where do you remember that? Where do you feel that in your body? Other places that we learn messages about sex from our parents, maybe you're lucky.
Or not. Maybe you didn't hear anything. That may have also been your experience, like it was mine.
I want to point out, like, post-COVID, this is the closest I've been to someone that I'm not married to. Love it. So if you were lucky and you got messages from your parents, typically what I hear from my clients is like, oh yeah, like they gave us the puberty talk, and then they kind of said, if you have any questions, come and see us. And probably as a kid you're going, what question do I have? I don't know. You want to say something, don't you?
Well, there's a lot of nonverbal messages you're probably getting from your parents, right, in regards to how they deal with affection or flirtation, or again, some comments kind of in the sly, like where they're not really talking to you directly about sex, but you kind of get the sense that there's something happening between them in their negotiation around sexuality. And a lot of times that's either conflict or tense ridden, depending on your upbringing.
We're also going off of that about, like, what scenes in movies did they skip through because they didn't want you seeing certain things? What things did they never bring up that you saw on screen and just pretended you didn't see it? So those things as well.
And then added to that, what level of affection did you see between your parents? Were they, did they hug? Did they kiss? Were they flirtatious with each other? Did you have any clue that they possibly might be having sex?
Sometimes those are traumatic things to remember. But it's actually good for kids to know you're kind of having some sex.
And that you weren't immaculately conceived.
Another place is from, your own education. If you're under the age of 40, you had the internet while you were growing up, so you probably might have used the internet to kind of teach you. Oh yeah, and by the way, girls do look at porn, so...
Wait, what?
Did you not know this? So what did porn teach you? A lot of porn tends to be very male-centric, penis-centric, so a lot of spontaneous orgasms happening, a lot of very cartoonish type of sexual behavior that you might see in porn.
And in heteronormative porn, the male and female always orgasm exactly at the same time, and it's mind-blowing. Generally not reality, in case you were wondering.
And then also, you just kind of, as a female, what did you observe in your own body? So, boys are born with external genitalia. They can just kind of look down and say, oh, hey, look, I have a penis. And you naturally, just kind of like when you get your new iPhone, you kind of like naturally intuitively know what to do. I think boys are kind of the same way with the genitalia. If you have more internal genitalia, you might not have been super aware of what it was, or maybe been a little bit encouraged not to explore that area.
This is not a question anybody needs to answer, but I wonder how many of you have actually taken a good look at yourself and really know what you look like.
If you're not sure, Natasha does have a vulva puppet on the Symmetry Solutions table out there if you want to check out what might be hidden.
For those of you at home, well, you have internet. So. Okay, so more explicit, meaning this is something that was kind of very directly told to you. Definitely have heard stories, maybe you've had this experience in your own life, that premarital sex is next to murder. It was really, really serious to not do this. Confessionals, I don't know if you or, some of your loved ones or friends have gone through confessionals. They can be kind of problematic. They can kind of go through a range here of being very kind and loving to downright punitive. Would that be too strong of a word? No? Okay.
Well, and even possibly abusive. I mean, there's situations where that's a setting for sexual assault to happen.
Yeah. And then the repentance process, for me, I think can be problematic because, as you've gone through some of these different seminars, what are they called? Breakout room sessions. You might have heard a lot of people talking about external authority versus your own internal authority. And if you go through a repentant process with a little bit more of a militant bishop, it might have been a lot of what he was telling you to do. A lot of external authority imposing on you what needed to be done for you to feel whole again. Explicit messages, maybe you got some idea from your parents or friends, like it was okay to have crushes, it was okay to kind of be like girly, romantic about, different things around romance, not necessarily around sex. So it was very constrained. Like you're allowed a little bit.
Well, and I would just say heteronormative crushes and romance.
Good point.
Yeah.
And so not a lot of talk, probably, that about you can actually enjoy any type of sensual excitement, not until you're married.
So a lot of the messages that then become kind of implicit, that maybe people aren't saying directly, but you kind of get the sense that this is what's happening, is that you get the sense that you're a gatekeeper of sexuality instead of an agent of sexuality. That your job is to protect yourself from the enemy, the boy, the male desire, even though then later you have to marry him and sleep with him. But not yet. In the meantime, he's just out to get you. So it's kind of like this kind of dangerous energy around sexuality. And that you're supposed to dress and act in ways that you're attractive enough to take home to mother, but not so attractive that you would, incite some type of erotic fantasy. So that's a nice balance for us all to be worried about. And that gives us a lot of internalized messages that can get kind of stuck in our bodies and can get stuck in our minds and in our own erotic templates that interrupt some of the developmental possibility that could have been if we would have been allowed to be more free in the things that we're thinking about. Girls are typically not asked about masturbation and pornography in the same ways that boys are in our church communities. I said that about 10 years ago in a podcast, and then I started noticing that they did start asking girls that. I'm like, I should really keep my mouth shut because I don't want them to be asking girls about that. But again, it kind of implies that boys are expected to be sexual, and so everybody just has that as a given, and that girls are the victims of that, sexuality. Again, not their own. Not how could a girl be interested in her own body or her own fantasies or her own erotic kind of energy. And everyone kind of talks to you, especially in your developmental years, like you are a virgin, like you haven't had any sexual experiences. So if and when you have, you already feel marginalized because nobody's including you in the conversation. And this is very additionally problematic if you're a victim of sexual abuse. Because again, from a developmental perspective, a lot of adolescents and pre-adolescents don't really understand the difference between whether or not they've been abused or if they've participated in something that they feel responsible for. So, and even the word virgin, I think is problematic in all of the baggage that kind of carries for us in this kind of world where we're either, whores or pure vessels.
And I think one other explicit and implicit message, I'm queer myself, and so explicitly, told being gay is bad, but implicitly, just people only asking about, who do you like? Who's your boyfriend? And so that can also be impacting your sexuality as well. I didn't realize I was queer till much later in life, I think because of some of those messages of you aren't a sexual being because you're not married to a guy. And so not realizing my sexuality. So just making a note of that.
So it's not just at church that we get a lot of messages. The media has a lot of kind of doozies as well. And so, I mean, pretty much any commercial is some type of message that you're not good enough in some way. You don't look the right way. You're not the right size. You're not perky enough. You're not the right age. And so that's, you take 50 years of that kind of stuff, and there's no, again, a lot of internalized messages. And that can, and it's not just how your body represents, but the types of sexual behaviors, like Colette mentioned, a lot of times in movies, when they do talk about or show scenes that have to do with sexuality, I almost think it's actually more, my personal opinion is that movies can be actually less realistic than pornography, quite frankly. Because of the romanticism, the lack of communication. You actually have a storyline that's very unrealistic usually, and you do have a lot of the mutual coming, ejaculating, all of that. Actually, in pornography, you don't. It's just the males that orgasm, really, for the most part. So that's more to reality. Unless you watch feminist porn, and then that's, yeah.
Porn.
Yeah, that's like more centered on female orgasm. So we're also getting a lot of messages about gender roles and what it means to be a female, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be sexy, what it means to be erotic or sensual. And so media has a lot of ideas about that and how you fit a certain script and role and how you show up in your own eroticism, right, and your own ways of having a sexual experience. And then what's interesting, too, is you're kind of the medical community, right? So did we have ever a doctor inquire about your sexual health, and how did that go? And were your concerns listened to? I mean, quite frankly, as we get to know more and more about diagnoses like vaginismus, vulvodynia, any type of dyspareunia, anything that has to do with genital pain, the overwhelming statistics are that women are going to like 5 to 10 different doctors before they get diagnosed correctly, before they're believed, before they're not told something like, it's all in your head, honey, have a glass of wine. And that has dramatically changed maybe in the last 7 to 10 years, especially as pelvic floor therapy has become a profession, which is quite fantastic. But if you were trying to get help for anything like that, like even in the 1990s or 2010s, you weren't having a lot of luck, and a lot of it was considered somatic. Like it's just, it's kind of your issue, you just need to relax. And now we know that there are tons of reasons why you could be having vaginal pain that are completely physiological. And of course, anytime you have physiological pain or perceived pain even, what does your body do? It tenses up, you hold your pelvic floor very closely, and you have involuntary spasms that keep your vagina from being able to go through the arousal process that is required for pleasurable penetration. So guess what, ladies? Sex is not supposed to hurt, ever. Unless you kind of want it to, but that's a different presentation. Even the first time, right? So when you think about honeymoon sex, especially in kind of a Mormon community where they know very little about arousal, about female arousal, about the time it takes to get aroused, about the natural course of desire, you have maybe a couple who's kissed a lot, maybe before they got married, and they're jumping right into kind of getting naked with each other and doing the thing, and it happens like in 5 minutes, and there's no room for really the type of preparation that a female body needs for pleasurable intercourse, not to mention that we're so freaking intercourse-centric when outer course is where it's at. In the sense of, a lot of the things that you can do to enjoy sexuality that doesn't have to do with something, being inserted into your vagina. And then where you asked about birth control oftentimes has side effects in regards to your desire. IUDs can have side effects.
Antidepressants can have side effects.
Right, medications that you're on, if you're on a diuretic or anything that has to do with drying you up. Well, guess what's getting dried up? Not just your nose, not just your throat, it's your vagina. So, but is anybody talking to us about this? What about postnatal care? Pretty much the direction I got was, well, wait to have sex until you're, 6 weeks out. I had a C-section my first time. I was expecting my vagina to be just fine. I had the most searing pain I had ever experienced after my C-section, completely shocked. Did anybody ever talk to me about any possibility about why that might be? And that has to do with, again, pelvic floor weakness. But I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what a pelvic floor was. I get grumpy.
Understandably so.
And the HPV vaccination, right? So I know living in Wichita, Kansas for the last decade, the uproars about getting our kids HPV vaccinated because somehow this is going to be about giving them permission to go have sex. And we're playing with people's lives when we are dealing with kind of sexual shame and a lot of sexual miseducation and myths.
Boys should get their HPV vaccination too, by the way.
That's right.
So this was something that I kind of came up with after a lot of reading and just kind of hearing my client's story, which is that female sexual identity tends to be developed through a social lens. Often their tucked away genitalia and social messages to not touch discourage women from developing an innate sense of belonging to her own sexual body. So if you flip that around, let me read it from my book. So you are meant to, you are not meant to be tucked away. You are meant to touch, feel, explore, and discover, and you are meant to belong to yourself.
The messages about ownership to another person is something that I would encourage you all to just kind of sit with for a minute or 2 or 10 or 3 days.
On the Helfer app, we have a poll about this. So I think the question is something like, who gets to own your sexual body? Is it yourself? Was it your parents? Was it your bishop? Was it God? Was it someone else? Or your spouse? I think I said those things. And if you think the answer might be self, I say, great, awesome. But also, I would invite you to think about how many times in your life those other sources were trying to claim ownership over your sexual body. So imagine this. And by the way, you're welcome to screenshot anything that we have on our slide too and share that. Imagine this. Imagine that you were a kiddo. If you were a kiddo like me and you had a park nearby, you went to the park and you played naturally. You explored. I was always drawn to sand, and I wanted to play in the sand. I like to get in there with my fingers and my hands and feel all the sensations. Sometimes on the top surface, it was really hot. If it was summer, and then you start digging down, and it's like, oh, it gets really cool. And that's a different sensation. And sometimes you could pour water on it, and then you could build sandcastles. Nobody had to tell me what to do because I naturally discovered it through play. So on the flip side of that, imagine that you had access. You could see a playground right down the street, but you were kind of told, hey, that's going to be a great thing for you to have, not right now, but later in life, when you can share it with someone else. And when you get to that spot later in your life, you kind of go, okay, so I heard this is going to be a great thing with this shared experience with this partner, and you're kind of going, well, I think we heard stories about this, but you don't have that innate sensory experience that's going to allow you to naturally know what to do. Do you want to share your other?
Yeah, another analogy I heard about this idea is imagine that we lived in a world where you never were taught driving. And you know that people drive, you see it happening and it's talked about, but you never get behind a wheel because that's not allowed. That's not something you do until you can do it with someone else, a partner, a very specific person, right? And so, like, you hear your friends kind of talking about driving and what they've heard from their older siblings, and you sometimes hear your parents talking about it, or you see them, you walk in on them going out for a drive, right? But you don't actually know, and then suddenly you find your partner, and they're like, sweet, here's your car, here are the keys, go have fun. What? Like, how is that logical? And how can we expect people to have a good experience, be able to play and explore on a playground in a sandbox when we don't give them permission to do it from a very young age and be able to teach them? You see how ridiculous it is with a driver's license. Like, you have to go through a process to learn to drive. One of my friends has a story that she was getting behind the wheel with her permit, and she could not figure out how to turn on the car. And so her mom was like, get out, and she got out, and so her mom walked around, got in, and it turned on just fine. And so my friend got back in, and it still wasn't working. They eventually figured out that her mom was forgetting to tell her she had to push on the brake as she turned the key. And you need to learn those basics. And if you wait until you are an adult, it can be a lot harder when it was so forbidden before. And then, so continuing on, we do want to give credit to Mormonism to an extent about some good things that you may have learned, or good things you may have learned about sex. In Mormonism, we have the beautiful doctrine that we came to earth to receive a body, and that bodies are good, and that we need them. And so hopefully, that is a sex-positive message, that bodies are a good thing. They're not inherently dirty. God created them, right? We're here for a reason. We have bodies. Hopefully, you also learned within your family of origin and other places that you have a right to privacy and you have a right to safety. Hopefully, you had the experience where you had private times that you could shut your bedroom door and be alone, or that you were even be able to be alone in the bathroom. You had that privacy. Maybe you had a journal that was yours and that no one could intrude on. You had rights to safety. Hopefully, statistically, people get abused, but hopefully you learned about safe practices, about, people shouldn't be touching these parts of you. These are yours. There's safety there. We also want to acknowledge that, as a baby, you're exploring your body naturally. I just got a niece and 2 nephews within the span of 3 months, so I'm suddenly an aunt 3 times over. And it's so fascinating just seeing them enjoy their bodies, sucking on their fingers, playing with their toes. And we all had that experience before we even had language, that we explored the world through our bodies, putting things in mouth, making sure that, these babies aren't shoving inappropriate things in there. And so you have taking in through the senses, you were learning. And also we should note that there are pictures of babies in utero masturbating. That is a natural body exploration, right? And maybe you also did receive the message that female sexual parts are life-giving and pleasure-receiving. Maybe you just got one or the other, maybe you didn't get either. But hopefully you at least got some of these, and these can be sex-positive messages that we can build from. Was there anything else you want to say on this one, Jenny?
Yeah, to be a little bit more explicit, if you look at specifically that last one about your female sexual parts, if you look at the breast, those are things that you can naturally do to give, food to babies, but they also can be a part of your sexual play. Same thing with your vulva, that whole vagina, vulva, it's all going to be uterus, it's all going to be part of, bringing life to the world. And also there is a part of the vulva named the clitoris that's just for pleasure. So those are, as you think about, our bodies being divinely created, it's like, well, let's notice that we have both of these, things inherently as part of our bodies.
Yeah, the clitoris is there for no other reason than for pleasure, in case you didn't know that. And so if we believe that bodies are divinely made, they're for a reason, right? But this next slide may be a lot longer of different messages that you may have received that aren't as sex positive. Just looking at that, I mean, that feels heavy. And I know that I personally identify with a lot of those. They make sense, right? These are things we hear from our clients daily about some not so great body messages, not great sex messages, all sorts of different things from all sorts of sources that are impacting their ability to have enjoyable sex.
Oh. You can't see it from there.
Can the lights be dimmed? Would that be helpful? Or I can read them. We just didn't want to overwhelm you.
I put a direct link to this slideshow too.
We're going to give a moment of silence.
For all the
and we
pain
would
on
just-
this slide.
And we would just like for you to look it over and kind of just think about how this might impact your life. And please notice what's happening in your body and in your mind as you look over some of these things that show up in our offices daily.
And as Josh said, also he posted a link to an view-only slideshow of this if you want to review on your own later too.
Can somebody turn the lights back on a little bit anyway so we can see you? Thank you back there. Thank you.
By the way, if you have any questions on that, on any of this, we're going to be around. So let's say you've gotten through all of this and you're like, hey, I'm in. How do I do this? How do I embrace my inner female sexual self? I'm going to borrow from the works of Tina Schermer Seller from her book, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. So she wrote a book about sexual shame from conservative religion. So this is not just a theme we see only in Mormonism. We see it in conservative religion as well. So it's frame, claim, name, and aim. So you're in. So you want to learn about how to embrace this yourself as a sexual being. You know, you need your education. You know, have you gotten your education about how your body functions? Have you gotten education on how sex is?
Do you know what a clitoris is?
And then we really encourage you to learn about what your own pleasure is. So as we mentioned earlier, there tends to be a message of, you know, sex is, and by the way, a lot of our clients, when they say, when my partner and I are intimate, we're like, well, what kind of intimacy are you talking about here? Are you talking about sex? Because that's different than all kinds of intimacy. So, yeah, if you're talking about sex, you know, has it been just, you know, intercourse only? Has it just been like something I give, you know, to my husband type of thing? Can I also own that I also have my own sense of pleasure? And then we really want you to invite kind of, again, what gender messages you received. What did your mom teach you? What did your aunt teach you? What did your sister teach you? What power messages did you learn growing up in the church from your family about what it meant to be a girl?
And we really recommend omgyes.com, a very research-based educational resource for understanding your genitalia and understanding your potential for orgasm and pleasure.
Thanks. Next, I forgot to put that on the resources, but maybe we can add it on later. Claim, we would love for you to just embrace your body as good enough, which in America it can be hard enough as it is, because we are constantly being told that we're not good enough. I will say that, let me know if you think differently, but I think those who are in the college age, I think they're starting to push back on that message pretty well, so I'm happy. I think it's going to start changing. we would love for you to permit yourself to heal from the constant messages that you might have gotten about that your body is not good enough. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. Sometimes that requires some journaling and some deep inner looking at yourself. And as you do this, please invite yourself to do this with a lot of compassion. So if it's something that you would share with your best friend or with a small child, it's probably a message that you can tell yourself. If it isn't something that you would say to your best friend or to a small child, then maybe you shouldn't say that about yourself.
OMGyes.com. Yes.
And that website can be quite a very empowering move that you can make on your behalf. Do you want to do this one?
Sure. And then name and share your story. Saint Brene Brown, as I jokingly, one of my prophetesses, she says shame needs 3 things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Shame needs 3 things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. And when you think about sex, has that been your experience, those 3 things? When you think about your sexuality? I know for me it's been very empowering as I've realized, hey, I'm queer, and I've talked about it to people, how much more I'm able to embrace myself as a whole human being, and that includes being a sexual person, right? My whole life isn't suddenly about sex now that I'm telling people that I'm queer. But that shame has lessened, and I can embrace this God-given side of me that, hey, I'm a sexual being. That's part of being human. And I like how Brene also emphasizes to share your story with those who've earned the right to it. You don't necessarily want to go around indiscriminately telling people your story, right? You want to be careful. I remember when I was coming out to people, and I was kind of hesitant, wasn't sure if I was ready. One person said, don't tell anyone until you're okay regardless of their reaction. So that was helpful with my coming out. But I think in owning our sexual story, be even more careful, right? Not everyone needs to hear it. You can think, okay, who does? Who can help me? Who's earned that right? Not everyone. And going back to some of those, talking about bishops, have they earned it? Or is that something that maybe you need to take back your ownership of your own story? Again, some of those messages you may have gotten can be tricky to untangle.
I really like the aim piece because I think that in a lot of ways we think of sexuality as something that should be organic and spontaneous, and if it's not happening in an organic or spontaneous way, we buy into this message that somehow we're broken or there's something wrong with us. And I think, like most things that are worthwhile in life, it takes intentionality, it takes effort, it takes energy. So are we going to give ourselves the permission to offer ourselves energy, time, maybe even money to help ourselves in this particular way? And so I think, visualizing what you'd like to see, or going to a therapist or a sexual educator who can help you with those visualizations, understanding your sexual values, reworking them. Most of us grew up with just what I call not values, more like to-do lists or not to-do lists. But what do we actually value in our sexuality? Do we value pleasure? Do we value commitment? Do we value adventure? Do we value eroticism? Do we value stability? You can value a lot of different things. It helps you understand your sexual style and what type of sexual showing up you want to do in whatever partnered sex you want to engage in, or even with yourself in solo sex. And then how can you cultivate sexual touch as spiritual, satisfying, and meaningful to you? A lot of times our bodies carry a lot of baggage just in how we accept touch, whether or not we're comfortable touching ourselves, whether or not we're comfortable with our partners touching us, and where and why and when. And I would also encourage you to think of the word spiritual in very different ways, because spiritual can play a very fine line with crassness, just like pain and pleasure play a very fine line in sexuality, right? So if you touch my nipple right now, I can tell you I'm going to punch you out. But if you do it in a space where I'm very aroused, I'd probably tell you harder, please, right? And I think that sometimes, we've been taught that dirty sex or crass sex or animalistic sex, which is actually a very normal part of playful and erotic and satisfying sexuality, can be seen as non-spiritual or non-righteous. So I would really encourage you to think about spirituality in a very different way when it comes to your sexual pleasure. Oh, good.
Cool. We just got the notice. We have 15 minutes left. Which
We wanted to make this a lot of question-centric.
yeah, we invite your thoughts, your comments, your concerns, anything we didn't talk about that you were hoping that we would. I'm going to leave the next slide open while we do that, which is some of our recommended resources.
If you'd like to come up, please come in and ask your question in the microphone so we can have that recorded. And we also have some on the app so we can answer those if we don't have anyone doing it live.
And again, if you're having a hard time seeing the slides too, there also is a link in the Whova app to these slides too. And these are just a beginning of some of the resources, a place to start.
And I just want to say, too, that I'm actually very glad, watch out with the mic, sorry. I'm very glad to see that there are some males in this presentation. I would ask that you remain as spectators during the Q&A part of this presentation.
My kids found my vibrator.
Woo woo!
So we talked about
Congratulations.
it. They were teens. What can you say is it healthy for them to know? Talk about.
We're all throwing a party for you. We're all like, woohoo! Well, I think that the interplay between, children and parents and sexuality is an awkward one. For good reason. We're not supposed to be coupling or having erotic, energy between children and parents. So that's why all the kids are supposed to say, ew, and you're supposed to cringe a little bit when you think about your own kids, enjoying sexual pleasure. There's something normal and natural about that. And I do think that each of you have the right to decide how much privacy you want with your kids. Your kids don't earn your sexual story just because they're your kids. So, but I do think that those are opportunities to give some basic education. And some thoughts I would have are like, yeah, sorry you found out that I'm a sexual being too. I know, that's gross. Sorry. Moms are sexual beings.
You have headphones.
And you can also, it's really an opportunity to talk about how sex toys can be something that is used for both solo, play, sexuality, and that it's important to have a good relationship with yourself sexually. And it's also something that can be used in partnership and can be an aid in coupled, relationships. And so you can keep it as simple as that. You can ask if they have questions. Usually at this point, my boys are running from the room. My non-gender binary child is like getting out their notebook, as far as all the questions that they have. So you may have different personalities, in your kids too, about how much they want to hear. And I would honor that for the most part. But any thoughts either one of you have on that one?
I also, just going back to when we think about what messages did we receive, silence is also a message. And so they haven't earned your story, but be aware that by not saying something, you're also saying something. So just be aware of those dynamics as well.
And think of it as an ongoing conversation. You're welcome to come up as we're talking. This is an ongoing conversation that you're having with your kiddos. It's not a one and done or thrice and done. It's like every 3 weeks.
And at any age. Please talk to your adult children too.
So I was reading something this week about mostly straight versus bisexual, and it said if it can be different from men, while close to 50% of women describe themselves as being mostly straight rather than totally straight. Fewer than 15% of men describe themselves as being mostly straight. Anyways, I was like, whoa, 50%. Anyways, it's kind of a topic that I've been thinking about, and I just wondered if you wanted to say anything.
Well, the research does show that vulva owners, vagina owners, tend to report more fluidity and flexibility in their sexual scripts and sexual tastes and sexual orientations than penis owners. And that also can shift throughout the life cycle. At the same time, there are people who would definitely, label themselves as very well grounded in a certain sexual orientation, such as straight or gay. And you also have to think, too, that whenever I see differences in men and women, like we love to, the Mars versus Venus stuff, I think a lot of times we like to assume that this is biological somehow or, somehow inherent. And I think we forget the astronomical social messages that affect male sexuality, that have a lot of internalized homophobia. All you have to do is Google toxic masculinity to get a sense of the messaging that young boys from a very early age get about not showing affection to other boys, about not touching other boys in certain ways. And so that internalized homophobia does have an impact as well. So I don't know that women are naturally more fluid than men, but I do think that we have been, in this one area, we have been given a lot more allotment for female touch. Even now, like I'm hugging, I'm touching, I can, whatever, like Jenny lets me do that. And nobody's really worried about whether or not I'm a lesbian probably right away, right? Whereas if a man is showing affection, it probably immediately all of us have a sense of, whoa, what's going on there? And men also have been greatly limited in their ability to emotionally express themselves. So, yeah. And plus we've eroticized lesbians for everybody.
Because lesbians are awesome.
Lesbians rock.
Ask a question from the digital viewers. I'm not sure if I am asexual or just grew up Mormon. Any advice?
First off, you are not alone. That is a very, 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 very common presentation in our offices.
Yeah, I mean, my concern with this question is that I never want to, the primary role of label is up to you. You're the primary person who can label yourself. At the same time, I think it's important for the Mormon female population to understand that the national statistic of people who would claim asexuality as their orientation tends to fall below 1%. And anecdotally, I should start taking down notes. It's not just anecdotally, but anecdotally in my office, I get this question from female bodies about 30 to 40% of the time. So I think that there's something dramatically different than I'm just asexual. But if you think about a woman who has been given these messages that we've been talking about for the primary focus of her life, where she's not been encouraged to explore her own body, her own eroticism, her own ability for sensuality, her own pleasure. There's a huge orgasm gap in this country. It's 70% to 100%. So 70% of orgasms for female bodies versus 100% for male. And I'm guessing that orgasm gap is much larger in conservative cultures like ours. I think that your body starts resisting sexuality, because why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't your body say, well, I have to look forward to putting out when I'm tired, when I'm not really in the mood. I'm probably not going to have an orgasm, but he really wants it, and I'm really feeling guilty because otherwise I'm not a good wife. So then I guess I'll just do it. And your vagina doesn't really care if you're married or not. Your vagina doesn't really care if you love this guy or not. It just knows that it's having to show up in a way that doesn't feel great. And you do that to your vagina and your body and your mind over and over and over and over again. And I might be considering myself asexual too. So I do think it's worth exploring. I think it's worth exploring because one of the ways that you can experience low desire in your life is because you've been suppressed or oppressed sexually. And I think we have. I think as Mormon women we have.
And going along with that, Jenny and I were able to attend a presentation that Emily Nagoski did, and it was phenomenal. And one thing she talked about, kind of going off that, is do you not want to have sex, you're not interested in sex, or you're not interested or wanting the sex you're having? And I think that kind of sums up what Natasha was saying. And I think again, going back to the disclaimer she said, like, labels can be helpful, but if it's hurting you, like, you don't need to label yourself asexual or not, but it is worth exploring with some of those questions she was going. But I just loved how Emily had summed that up so succinctly. I'm like, oh yeah, if I was having sex like that, I wouldn't want to be having sex like that. So something to consider for sure.
Another thing that we didn't have time to get into today is that women tend to have a different, sexual responsive desire than men do. Men tend to have a lot more spontaneous sexual desire than women do. Women tend to have more responsive sexual desire. I'm going to refer you the #1 book that all females should read, period.
And all their partners.
And their partners. Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. I consider it to be the gold standard. But in there, you're going to learn about how female women really they're very context dependent. They need to have a lot of the right things in place in order for their brain to even start to consider that they might want to have some sort of pleasurable sexual experience happening. It's very responsive. They can have spontaneous desire, but likely they're going to have a lot more responsive desire.
And again, my theory is that this is not so much a biological difference as it is a socially cultured difference. Because we have been told from a very early age that context matters and that we should be swept away and romanticized and wooed and emotional and all those things. Which then we're also ignoring the many women who have a whole hell of a lot of spontaneous desire and want to fuck all the time, and then we shame them and slut shame them. And that's a whole nother conversation. And I use crass language on purpose. I want to make you uncomfortable. Lovingly.
So my question is, I have a new teen daughter, and I'm realizing that even though I'm really deconstructing these messages, part of me is like, okay, purity culture is the devil I know. And I'm okay. I'm figuring it out, and it's scary I don't know what another way looks like. So I would, and really it feels safe. It feels very safe. At least I know these are going to be emotional issues. I can do that with you, So I would love to just talk about how you frame this for a teen, especially in a place like this where there's a high density of LDS teens. And I worry also that her self-concept is pretty fluid, and that being judged by another kid actually really does probably have an effect on who she is and who she becomes. And so I feel I'm taking that into account and not really sure how to navigate her claiming authority and also not becoming a reflection of what she's feeling projected on her.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and we could probably do a whole nother thing on parenting children.
We'll make a note for a presentation next year on that.
I would make a recommendation for the book For Goodness Sex by Al Vernacchio. And what I like about his approach is that first of all, we're not saying that you shouldn't teach your kids your own values. So this is not about going from don't have premarital sex to just go do whatever you want. And so I think it's important to teach your kids your values, and you can still say things like, for me, if this is your value, for me, I think the best kind of sex is if you are in a committed relationship, where there's trust and commitment. And at the same time, here's some information you need to know, regardless of what my values are. You just need to have certain information. But I also think it's really important to start talking to kids about the 6 principles of sexual health, which I think is much more protective, actually, than just don't have sex before you're married. And that has to do with consent. We're having a big discussion in our nation currently about consent. The freeze response is real. That space where your daughter's like, oh, I want to be cool and chick, and oh, this guy's kissing me, or this girl, or whomever, and then feeling like in that moment where she's pushed a little further than she felt comfortable, what do I do? And and this is where it gets really messy, and all the discussions we're having about date rape and whether or not people even knew that it was date rape. It's very messy because people don't always know what they want or know how to negotiate things, especially at a young age. So I would go through the 6 principles of sexual health, which you can find on my website, natashahelfer.com. And also, I think, too, really helping kids. I think the narrative we got is if you make a mistake, you're doomed. Right? If something happens to you, you are doomed. And how about this whole thing of, oh, okay, well, maybe you found out something about yourself. Or, oh, now you know something that you don't enjoy or that you do want to put boundaries up with. Or, instead of once you've done something, well, I'm damaged goods anyway, so why not just let anything happen at this point? No, you can always retract, and you can gather information, and you're a data collector, and how are you going to figure out what feels good for you, what you feel safe with? Here's my best thinking as your mom. Here's what I hope for you. Here's some basic information you should know. At the end of the day, you're going to be okay, little one. You're going to be okay.
And also, I liked what you said about just having that space for giving them to figure it out. I think you need to give yourself that space to figure out how to parent and talk about sex, because you weren't given a model for that. And so it's okay that you don't show up perfectly every time. You're showing up and you're trying to have these conversations, and you get a lot of credit for that in my book.
All right, we are done with our time. Thank you for staying to the last session. It was wonderful. And, thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of your time at Sunstone the next 2 days. Thank you.